Hello, welcome to this how-to. Today we're going to be looking at how an Agile approach can de-risk your multi-team programs. Okay, so let's look at some of the traditional approaches and some of the challenges that we see with those. So one of the models I see regularly is where you have your idea up front, that gets passed to one team, typically a sort of front-end team, team at the end of the chain. They then create some requirements and push that onto a second team, and then they create requirements, push it onto a third team, and that can go on for as many teams as are involved. They then complete their work. So typically the team furthest back down the chain will complete their work first. They will then pass it on to the second team, who will then complete their work, and the third team, until you have that end-to-end flow. The challenge with this approach, or the largest challenge, is that once you've created something at the start of your journey, you're then tying down future teams to using that approach. And that means you may be giving up on an optimum end-to-end approach because you're tying yourself into that initial approach very early on. The other challenge with this approach is quite simply that the team furthest, this team right at the start, doesn't have a very good view of what the program product is actually doing. And that makes it hard for them to be engaged. It makes it harder for them to make good decisions. And therefore they have to rely on the requirements very carefully, and they have to be perfect requirements. And they also have to rely on the teams and taking their time in order to ask questions, which naturally slows things down. So some real challenges around this approach in my experience. The other typical model I see is this sort of top-down model where you have a design team up front who take the idea and then sort of build around that. They then pass that on to a number of teams, all of which have their part to build, their puzzle piece to create. Often they're overseen by a delivery manager or project manager who coordinates that work between the team. But it is very much about coordinating, and quite often those teams aren't working on those puzzle pieces at the same time. The risk I see with this approach is you often have those puzzle pieces not fitting together very well at the integration stage, which is often late on. And that means that you then have to do a lot of rework. You get a late change in the project or program timescales, which isn't good for anyone, and certainly doesn't look good to your customers as a technology team or group. So a lot of the challenges around that approach of building the puzzle pieces and then putting them together, expecting them to all fit perfectly. We typically, in my experience, no matter how much time you spend on the requirements, no matter how much time you spend on the design, there's always something that gets in the way and means you need additional rework, or you haven't created the optimum solution. So instead, we recommend using a collaborative approach. So you have the idea or goal and you push that to a number of teams who are collaboratively working on that problem at the same time. It's really important that those teams have time together to work on that. And that's the first challenge that you'll need to look at how you overcome. So how do you free up those teams to have time to work those challenges at the same time? There's loads of different techniques you can use for using those to bring those teams together in a collaborative way. The single most important thing I see is making sure that they're attacking shared challenges. So rather than sort of breaking down the problem into those puzzle pieces, however you're describing your needs, typically it's often user stories. Create user stories that cover the full need end to end. And that might encompass several teams. And in most cases, you hope it will. So in that case, the teams have to work together within that sort of, if it's Scrum, typically 2-week window to come together to deliver that end-to-end piece of work. This means you're massively de-risking things because those connections are made from the start and you can build up from those connections. The other thing it allows you to do is to really build in terms of the sort of the functionality you're creating. How do you create functionality that de-risks your approach? So you've got your idea, you've got your collaborative program team. You then are likely to work towards an initial sort of slice, those end-to-end user story slices, which creates sort of end-to-end integration. This can be very simple. I sort of think back to a very large program we did where we had a number of teams and we literally passed an ID from one end of the chain to the other to connect all the systems. Very simple, didn't give any business value, but really de-risk things by demonstrating we could integrate end to end, and then we could build slices on top of that really nicely. So that really sort of gave that foundation. We then look to build up to where we have something that's usable by early adopters. This doesn't mean it needs to be beneficial. Early adopters by their nature will like to play with new toys. So you just need to get out there, make it optional, find some people who want to explore something new, who want to be able to have a voice in how it works. And they will happily pick up something that maybe they do have to work between two systems. If you're replacing a monolithic system, maybe they do still need to do some of their work on that original monolithic system. But give them access to the new functionality. Make sure that you're learning from that and you're proving the approach actually works and uncovering any issues. And this really de-risks from a usability and genuine value output to make sure you really are driving the change that you want to. The next stage is the usual first stage that most people think about. So do you get MVP? But when you're building slices, you'll probably find you naturally can make this smaller, because you can say to your business partners, look, we have this thing ready. We have this thing that can actually give you benefit today. We're going to keep working on it, but why don't you roll it out? What's stopping you from rolling it out? And that's a much easier conversation to have than saying, actually, we want to build towards this minimum viable product. So it makes that conversation much easier and much more likely to happen earlier when people can actually see and touch that product. And then the last stage is all around building that incremental value. So at each stage, you build something small, another slice on top, which gives some new functionality, really reduces the risk, because if you cancel at any point, all you've lost is that last increment. So you always you're always getting to a point where you're getting more business value. So there you go. There's an example of how you can use an agile approach to de-risk your programs. One thing we haven't talked about here is items outside of your teams and your program. So there could be hardware, there could be rollout. There's some details on how you can approach this in a separate article, which is called How to Deliver to a Specific Date. You can find that on our website or looking back through our posts. Okay, so that's it for this week. Please make sure that you follow the Practical Agile Company London in order to be made aware of future updates and future articles. Goodbye from us.